A few days before my sentencing, I want to share these words with as many people as possible. I know it will be hard to believe me, but at least I want you to keep this version in mind, which, even if it is not considered by the judge, will be recorded in your minds, with the hope of preventing it from happening to anyone else. I was driving my taxi. It must have been around 1 in the afternoon. I had been working since the morning because I had to take midterms that night. I was studying law, and my parents were financing my education while I relied on what I earned from my job. I always liked to buy things for myself, but they insisted that my education was part of their responsibility as parents, and I couldn't argue with them. A few hours later, I calculated that after picking up 2 more passengers, I would go home to shower and get ready. A teacher got in, feeling comfortable enough to sit in the passenger seat. She talked about her day, which had been stressful, but she was excited because her mother had visited her recently. I told her I hoped I would do well on the midterms that night, that I had studied a lot, and I aimed for a good GPA to keep a scholarship that covered 30% of my tuition. My parents knew this, and sometimes mentioned it proudly. Those words of pride made me so happy and motivated me every time I remembered them. The next passenger was a girl. She looked about 24, pretty and with a good figure. She also sat in the passenger seat, but with her, something very curious happened. From the moment she sat down and I accelerated, she began to flirt with me shamelessly. She was so determined that I felt uncomfortable but flattered at the same time. She said that someone like me deserved all the money in the world, and started complimenting every part of my body she could see. She ran her hands over her skin, biting her lips, which distracted me from the road, forcing me to slow down to avoid an accident. At one point, she leaned over and ran one of her fingers over my lips, brushing against my teeth. It felt pleasant, but after doing it, she leaned back, crossed her arms, and stared straight ahead with a serious look. The change in attitude was drastic and extremely dramatic. I thought it was a game, and she did with me whatever she wanted until she could. We reached a red light and continued without saying a word, and then she took a powder container from her bag and threw it in my face. I was stunned by the powder for a few moments, but when I regained my sight, she had disappeared. I didn't hear the sound of the door opening or closing, and I couldn't see her through the glass. The place was deserted, and it was impossible for her to run away so quickly. I felt like a fool. That girl had completely fooled me, but nothing could shake the thought that it was impossible for her to vanish like that. I cleaned my face as best I could and then started again, this time heading home. But then, I began to feel a discomfort in my lips, and they started to hurt while my body went numb. The first thing that came to my mind was that the girl had somehow made me ingest some hallucinogenic substance that she might have had on her finger, but the sensation was incredibly strange. My body went numb, but I didn't lose strength, just control. My feet kept pressing the pedals, and my hands turned the steering wheel as if my mind was ordering them without me having to make any effort. Soon my vision blurred so much that everything was blurry, and even then I didn't stop. I recovered a few minutes later, feeling perfectly normal, but then I noticed something strange. There were no cars on the streets, and all the traffic lights were green. There was an overwhelming and terrifying silence hard to explain. I drove slowly at first, but since everything seemed normal, I accelerated, and then I hit something I couldn't see. It wasn't my imagination. The car was jolting with the impacts, but there was nothing in front of me, not to the sides nor behind. I was terrified of thinking I was hallucinating and would wake up in a much worse situation after someone had done something to me, so I desperately sped up. I hit something invisible again and again, and then I started hearing people screaming at me, cursing, and others yelling for me to stop. Then I heard police sirens, but everything remained the same. I couldn't see anything. It wasn't until I crashed into something that shook me completely, forcing the car to stop and deploying the airbags. I didn't lose consciousness completely, so with the little strength I had, I opened the door and got out. I fell to the ground, and then I looked back. Smoke, a crowd, screams, hatred, desperation. All of that reflected in people crying over others who lay on the ground. They kept cursing me, and then I realized the reality before fainting. I had done that. I woke up in a hospital where I was handcuffed to the bed. An officer in front of me told me that I was responsible for taking the lives of more than 15 people, including children. I explained what happened, but the tests showed that my mind was not disturbed by any foreign or hallucinogenic substance. It didn't make sense. I was sure that woman must have done something to me, but no one believed my version. I will accept the judge's sentence, and I hope these words help prevent this from happening to anyone else. Evil has many ways of manifesting itself, and one very common way is to use tempting faces and bodies that take us away from reality. Thank you, the dark side, for sharing my story. When at gatherings, parties, or friendly or family meetings people mention incoherent, controversial, hard to believe, or inexplicable cases, what always comes to mind is what happened to me in 2017. Never in my life would I have expected something like that, and the way it all ended left me sleepless for several nights, to the point of needing professional help from psychologists and others just to have a chance to move on with my life, leaving it all behind. My name is Renee, and this is my story. At that time, I had been working as a taxi driver for more than 5 years. I started when my mother got sick, and my siblings turned a blind eye. I was forced to leave my studies to start working and pay for her medications, which were not cheap at all. Our father abandoned us when we were very young. I had heard he was expecting twins with his new wife, and it was more than clear that his old family was a thing of the past. It seemed unfair that all the responsibility fell on my shoulders, but the nights talking with my mother were the best part of the day. They relieved my stress. We watched movies, ate ice cream, and I really felt like a kid again by her side. The cancer spread, and the doctors did all they could, but I praised her strength. She looked perfectly healthy. If it weren't for her hair, no one would think she was ill. Every morning before I left for work, she gave me God's blessing, and that strengthened me. Then the unexpected day came. It must have been around 7 in the evening, more or less. I had a good day overall, barely having time for lunch. I truly felt blessed, and I planned to take my mom out for the weekend. She deserved it. My mind was focused on that until I saw 2 men on the sidewalk waving at me. I felt a bit tired, so I decided that after taking them, I would go home to rest. I would have time to watch a movie with my mom, or so I thought. One man got in the back and the other in the passenger seat. The latter was holding a Bible in his hands and had a smile that amused me a bit. They had already told me where they wanted to go, so I started heading in that direction. They soon started a conversation, and the topic was uncomfortable, to say the least. They said that the Christian Bible was pure nonsense and that most of it was made up or altered stories to create a system to control the masses. It sounded like a conspiracy theory to me, but I held back my laughter to avoid seeming rude. They were strangers anyway. I just needed to ignore them until they got off, and then it happened. The man in the passenger seat dropped the Bible, pulled out a gun, and pointed it at my head, pressing the barrel against it. He told me to stop at the next corner and move to the back, saying his companion would take the wheel. My body started shaking and I was filled with terror. I hadn't expected something like that. They seemed religious, apparently. I was completely fooled, but figuring out something like that was difficult. I just had the bad luck of picking up those 2 psychopaths. With no other choice, I did what they asked. I stopped the car and moved to the back. One of them started driving while the other pointed a second gun at me. They began laughing maniacally and shaking hands as if they had succeeded in some important mission. Their appearance as sane people vanished completely. They started widening their eyes in an incredibly exaggerated and uncomfortable way. The one threatening me waved the gun in a very peculiar way with his wrist, making me feel like he could shoot at any moment, ending my life instantly, or plunging me into uncontrollable, unbearable pain. There was no thought that could bring me any calm at that moment. Only a miracle could save me, and they weren't fools. They took my phone and searched me to make sure I wouldn't become a problem later. Suddenly, they started mentioning a strange name, one I had never heard in my life. So much so that I can't remember it clearly, and I wasn't even sure they were referring to a person. They just said that This sacrifice would make him happy, and then the exile would end. They would redeem their mistake and be welcomed back. I focused on the word sacrifice and associated it with the imminent idea that I wouldn't return home alive. I cried, and in the midst of my sobbing, those two started mocking me, asking if I was scared. I noticed a sudden change in their voices. They suddenly became higher pitched, as if trying to mimic a clown. They made it clear that what they were going to do to me would be extremely painful, and they would enjoy it like I had no idea. I thought of my mother. Without me, she had no one to buy her medications or look after her health. My siblings wouldn't go to her unless she died because of the inheritance of some houses in the town she inherited from my grandfather. They were as miserable as those who had me kidnapped in my own taxi. We spent about half an hour wandering on the road. They said we were almost there, but I realized we were going in circles. We passed the same street 3 times, until the one threatening me with the gun told me to lie down and keep my head down, away from the window. A few more minutes passed, and then they stopped the car. They both told me that if I lifted my head in less than 10 minutes, I would suffer worse than I could imagine. I kept crying and begging them to spare my life. They didn't hit me. In fact, they didn't even touch me. The only contact I had was with the gun to my head. They got out of the car and I stayed there crouched for a while. I didn't move until I heard sirens approaching. It was the police. They opened the doors and pulled me out. They found me in such a pathetic state that it was pitiful. They interrogated me and I told them everything that happened. Hours later, they caught the kidnappers and interrogated them. That was the most controversial part of the case. They had abandoned me under a bridge and were caught trying to rob a closed toy store. They told the police they belonged to a sect they had been expelled from and were only seeking redemption to return. The intriguing part was that when asked about me, they refused to talk. They confessed to everything they were accused of, but never explained why they did it or why they spared my life. They were imprisoned, and I never heard from them again. I have spent the rest of my life wondering, what happened? I hope never to find the answer. Working as a taxi driver is a job that, while some consider stressful, for me it's quite the opposite. Talking to passengers and learning about the diverse lives people lead compared to others is somewhat interesting. Yes, it can be a bit tiring, but I've gotten used to seeing the glass half full. These thoughts gave me such a high level of confidence that I made a decision not only doubtful, but also questionable, and that's what led to this story that happened in 2019. My name is Mateo, and I've always enjoyed getting along well with other taxi driver colleagues. In fact, I had a WhatsApp group with some of them to keep informed about any accidents or other issues that might block the roads and cause delays. On a friend's advice, I started using the Uber app since it was a good way to find passengers while driving around the city. To be honest, it was very helpful. The change was noticeable, especially in my earnings, and that not only lifted my spirits but also my wife's, who was pregnant at the time. We saved the extra money for the baby's birth, and whatever we had left at the end of the month, we used to buy things the baby would need. We didn't want the birth to catch us off guard, and thank God we were doing well in all aspects considered essential. Suddenly, some colleagues began saying that a request from a passenger outside the city appeared on Uber in the early hours of the morning. According to some, all the taxi drivers who accepted the ride disappeared. I remained very skeptical about this because, curiously, those who disappeared weren't people I knew, so I couldn't verify if it was true or just a hoax, a story to scare my colleagues and reduce competition. But even so, the matter with that passenger stuck in my mind. I couldn't shake it no matter what I did to distract myself. Then it happened that one of my closest colleagues wrote to me saying he would accept that passenger's ride at night, and the next day, just as the rumor had it, he disappeared. That's when I confirmed the rumors were true, and I seriously considered uninstalling the app to avoid the temptation. I ignored that idea, but it cost me dearly for not having enough courage. One night, lying next to my wife, I heard my phone ringing incessantly with notifications. That woke me up and made me check what it was. To my surprise, it was that passenger requesting an Uber starting at 2 in the morning. My shock was because I didn't even have Wi-Fi or mobile data turned on. There was no way that notification could come through, but it did. I ignored it and managed to fall back asleep without any issues. The next day, I was overwhelmed by the anxiety caused by my curiosity about what was happening out there. Checking the WhatsApp group, I found messages where my colleagues said they had found the lifeless bodies of the disappeared drivers. The state they were in was extremely horrifying. Whoever did that had committed a very inhumane, unforgivable act that deserved the maximum penalty. I spare the description because seeing the images almost made me vomit in the car. When night came, I was more tempted than ever and time flew by. I don't know when it happened, but the clock struck 2 in the morning, and I was astonished. I had completely lost track of time, and then the notification from that passenger came again, this time with a little more detail. I saw it was an apparently normal girl, but what shocked me was the large amount of money she offered for the ride. I decided to accept, and she then left a comment assuring that she would pay more upon arrival. I only thought about my pregnant wife and how that money would help us a lot. So I went. I tried to keep my mind blank, without stress or anything, trying to convince myself that she was just an ordinary passenger and that was it. Of course, it was impossible to ignore that if she offered all that money, it had to be for something. I arrived after half an hour and it was indeed very far. I saw her standing by the side of the road, with a bag hanging from her shoulder and her hands clasped over her lap. I stopped beside her, and she kindly asked if I was the Uber driver. I said yes. She got in and I immediately turned around to head to the destination marked in the app. Then, fear wasn't what made me uncomfortable, but her beauty. She was exceedingly beautiful, and her angelic voice captivated me. She started by saying she thought no one would accept the ride, and without mentioning it, she took out 2 wads of cash and placed them next to me. She said the rest would be transferred, and I just nodded. I was nervous, and I got to a point where I didn't even know why. We had a normal conversation and suddenly she told me to stop, so I did. I asked what was happening, and she got out of the car. She examined something by the side of the road, which was just brush, and after a few seconds she got back in the car. We continued the journey, and when I asked, she said she would tell me later. I was filled with intrigue. She didn't seem to have bad intentions towards me, but I didn't want to be too trusting either. She repeated this process twice more. I would stop, she would get out, look around, and then we would continue. Then she told me that in the places where she stopped, she had taken the lives of the other taxi drivers who had come for her, but every time she got out, they abandoned her and left. The problem wasn't believing her words, but trying to understand how she took their lives once they left her there alone. My mind couldn't even form a hypothesis. I was frozen. Something inside told me she wasn't lying, and it was best to stay calm. With each passing second, terror took over me. My hands on the wheel were shaking, and I was sweating despite the car's air conditioning. I had to disguise my agitated breathing, and I glanced at her from the corner of my eye, who kept her gaze fixed on me, waiting for me to do or say something that would give her a reason to take my life. Who knows how, just like she did with the others. I didn't know what to do. I felt tied up and out of options. I was making a superhuman effort not to cry, and then she said to stop again. I did. She got out, and instead of checking the area, she turned around and stood by my window. I rolled down the window, and the last thing she said was that this was as far as she could go because she lost her life in that area. She walked away while the car's headlights lit her up until she disappeared into the darkness down the hillside. Upon returning to the city, I received a transfer for the amount she mentioned, and it was very, very large. I was the taxi driver who survived, and no one believed me when I told them what had happened except for one of my colleagues who had conversations with one of the disappeared. In the early hours, he received a message saying the passenger he picked up was beautiful. Reading that, I had no doubt. It was her. There are things that happen in the world that have no explanation, and it might even sound ridiculous to some people, but they happen. Many dark events occur every day, but the news will never reveal such strange events. Have a good evening, community, and thank you for listening. I have been in prison for years, longer than I'd like to admit, and all for a crime I didn't commit. I don't know how or why it happened. Maybe it was God's retaliation for my sins, or perhaps bad luck knocked on my door and barged in without a care. No, I have no idea what caused it, but the judges don't care, nor do the lawyers, and certainly not the other inmates. My name is Osvaldo Quintana, and this is my tragic and unjust story. I worked as a taxi driver. I had no choice. I was rejected several times by universities, and anyone would feel discouraged by that. The pressure from my parents was overwhelming, so I decided to live with a friend while I started working. My expenses were moderate and I had no responsibilities, so I managed without my parents' help, barely answering their calls. I felt deeply offended by everything they said, knowing I did everything I could to make them proud of me. I wasn't a criminal, nor was I involved in illegal substances or drugs. None of that interested me. I just focused on doing things right. I woke up very early and came home very late. My friend was also a taxi driver, but since I was more disciplined than him, I earned more. I kept this from him to avoid any problems. I kept to myself and rarely talked about personal matters. I wanted to save enough money to go to a private university and start my studies in microbiology. I often bought books on the subject and learned little by little, preparing for when the moment of truth would arrive. Unfortunately, life had other plans for me, plans that I still don't understand to this day. I've tried to convince myself that everything happens for a reason, but my faith diminishes with every second I spend behind these bars. It happened almost 2 months after I left home. I was driving down the street, waiting for someone to hail me, when I reached an area where a large crowd had gathered. They were blocking traffic, forcing many of us to turn off our cars and approach to see what was happening. According to those who had been there longer, a man had killed 8 people on the 10th floor of a building. 2 families and a cleaning staff member were among the victims. The crowd was there because the killer hadn't been caught and was still at large. The police were searching, but the crowd made their job very difficult. They managed to clear the crowd, and I returned to my car just as a man arrived and asked if I could take him to the airport. I hadn't picked up any passengers for at least an hour, so I felt relieved and told him we would leave immediately. We got in the car and started driving as soon as the crowd dispersed and allowed traffic to move. On the way, I tried to make conversation, but then the image of that calm, tranquil, and seemingly sociable man vanished. It felt like he had become a different person, looking around frantically, his pupils darting about. He wasn't just nervous, he was scared of something, which put me in a similar state. I couldn't help but ask if something was wrong or if something was bothering him. He seemed to hear my words a minute later and then responded. His voice was shaky, and he started hyperventilating. In that state, he confessed that he had done something bad, very tragic and unforgivable. I asked him what it was, and at that moment, the car radio played the news about the deaths in the building. My mind started putting everything together immediately, and I stayed silent. The man in the back seat then said that he was the one who had killed those people, and that's when I noticed he was holding a knife, his hands stained with blood, as was his shirt. I felt like an idiot for not noticing sooner, but I was sure that when he got into the taxi, he didn't look like he did now. I panicked and managed to send a message to my friend asking him to call the police and inform them of the situation, telling them I was heading to the airport. I tried to stay calm, but the radio began announcing that one person was missing and must have been kidnapped by the murderer. I asked him where the missing girl was, and without hesitation, he told me she was in the trunk of the car. Upon hearing that, I had already arrived at the airport. I stopped and looked him in the eyes. He wasn't lying. He was crying and gripping the knife tightly. I didn't even have time to react. The police arrived and forcefully opened the taxi doors. In the chaos, they pulled me out and I lost sight of the man. I began shouting at the officers to arrest him, that he was the culprit, not me. They searched the car, and I was shocked to hear one of the officers say there was no one in the back seat. They checked the trunk and found the girl alive, unconscious, and tied up. I had no idea when she was put there. If it was during that crowd, someone should have seen it. How could that have gone unnoticed? They took me to the police station as the suspected murderer of everyone. I explained everything 1,000 times, and in the end, they asked me to describe the man. I gave the description, and they realized it matched the characteristics of one of the 8 people who were murdered. Nothing made sense. I was going crazy, and they didn't care what I said. They sentenced me to more than 30 years in prison, and they haven't reduced my sentence. To this day, I still don't understand what happened, and I've been mistreated so badly in prison that I don't know why I haven't felt the urge to take my own life. Thank you for listening to my story. Greetings to everyone from Ecuador. Good night.